A little after 2 o'clock on the afternoon of June 18, 1815, the Scots Greys, a celebrated elite British cavalry regiment, participated in a counter-attack that in minutes destroyed a massive French infantry assault. But within the next half an hour, the Scots Greys ended up being decimated as a fighting unit for the rest of the battle. Only 40 out of the 400 cavalrymen who charged managed to rally back in their own lines. In 1881, Lady Butler exhibited her epic painting, Scotland Forever, with the unspoken intent of glorifying the Scots Greys, shown beginning their fateful reckless charge at the Battle of Waterloo. This dynamic, action-filled artwork contrasted with most of her other large military paintings, which depicted scenes of the realistic gloom and war weariness suffered by exhausted soldiers. Lady Butler stated her opinion of war and how she depicted it in her military art.
My own reading of war is that it calls forth the noblest and the basest impulses of human nature.
The original painting, Scotland Forever, in its impressive size, measures 40 inches tall by 76 inches wide. Whether a viewer sees the picture in person, or studies its reproductions in smaller sizes, the same reaction of being awestruck is likely to occur. Lady Butler composed an action-packed scene using the fullest capacity of her artistic talent, in conjunction with her thorough dedication to portraying military history with exceptional accuracy. The foremost dramatic action in the painting is obviously the white horses to the front of everything, appearing as if they are about to jump out of the picture and overrun the viewer, who is frozen in place while staring at the bulging crazed eyeballs of the horses. Foam spraying from the horses' mouths, and their wildly flying horse manes, only instills more alarm at the spectacular sight. Rather than depict a simple straight line of horses in the foreground, Lady Butler cleverly composes a three-dimensional illusion, by bending the line into an arrow, with the tip at the center, being the commanding officer. This setup entices the viewer to study the picture in a continuous flow from the middle of the image and then out towards the sides, where the soldiers become less defined and look smaller. Lady Butler's excellence in portraying the realistic anatomy of horses in full stride is prominent in Scotland Forever. The dynamic horses are shown in various poses of the correct striding of their legs, which would otherwise not be seen clearly during a top-speed charge. Though Lady Butler never mentioned him in her autobiography, one has to wonder if the horses she painted in Scotland Forever were inspired by a spectacular 1878 discovery that barely predated the 1881 exhibition of her painting, and the project's actual beginnings in 1879. That discovery belonged to Edward Maybridge, who in the preceding years had developed camera experiments to recreate fast movements caught in stop-motion photography sequences. This was considered to be the starting point in the evolution of movie films and cinematography. The 1878 invention was highlighted worldwide by the publication of a sequence of a horse shown distinctly galloping. This rapid movement had never allowed the horse's legs to have been seen in clear motion by the human eye. Artists up to this point could only guess the galloping poses of a horse. But no artist had ever correctly shown the horse when its legs were at full stretch, and they always depicted this pose for their speeding horses, with all four hooves off the ground. But the elaborate experiment set up by Maybridge showed that horses in their outstretched position always had one leg touching the ground. And he proved that only when the horse is in mid-stride, with all four legs tucked underneath its body, that the horse is completely off the ground. Interestingly, a decade before creating Scotland Forever, Lady Butler had sketched a dramatic image with some similarities to the painting, showing horses galloping head-on, at breakneck speed. She did this picture in February of 1870, while in Italy, during a trip to Rome. It was there that she attended a bizarre carnival, watching a 400-year-old long-standing traditional spectacle of 15 to 20 riderless horses that were forced to race through a street which was lined on both sides with wild spectators who were packed together. It was known as the Race of the Barbary Horses. She observed the distress suffered by the badly treated horses involved. But she also added, as a footnote, her delight in finding out that the Barbary race event was subsequently abolished in 1882. Lady Butler's actual name was Elizabeth Southerden Thompson. She was born to affluent British parents in 1846, at the Villa Clermont near the town of Lausanne in Switzerland. Both her arts-loving mother and her motivating father lovingly provided all they could for Elizabeth's lifelong growth as a talented, cultivated, and strongly independent-minded artist. Ever since her early vivacious and free-spirited childhood years, and even as a little 7-year-old girl, young Elizabeth had a bizarre fascination for sketching soldiers fighting in battles. Throughout her many family travels across Europe as a youth, and during her years of formal art studies in England, she passionately filled her sketchbooks with scenes of everyday people along with soldiers on and off duty, and inevitably, always horses. Elizabeth fondly remembered such times in her early 20s, especially while attending the South Kensington Female School of Art for student girls and young ladies. It was there that Elizabeth's skills and dedicated learning became recognized by her friends and teachers. She was very kind to her supportive classmates, and even on occasion happily gave away her sketches to them as gifts.
I gave sketches to nearly all of my fellow students, fights around standards, cavalry charges, thundering guns.
Between 1868 and 1870, Elizabeth's pursuit as an artist became more determined and focused. In March of 1868, she had a memorable meeting with the celebrity British art critic, John Ruskin, who was acquainted with her parents and visited her family at their home. He took great interest in studying the artwork Elizabeth showed him. Ruskin offered a good deal of constructive criticism, but was also very impressed by the young artist's potential, especially with one of her watercolors featuring a military artillery scene. He praised her by announcing that there was no reason why she could not become a great artist, and as a premonition, he added, she was destined to do great things. Later that summer, the Southerden family extensively visited Italy once again. In the first leg of the tour, they resided in Genoa, going into the next spring. The city was where Elizabeth was raised with much affection in her early childhood years. And then, in April of 1869, the family made their way by train to Florence, the renowned city of classical art. The only thrilling moment Elizabeth had, during that otherwise mundane voyage, was during the stopover at the railway station at Pisa, where she had a pleasant view of the famous Leaning Tower. Upon arriving in Florence, the family took up temporary residence at the Villa Lamperecci. Here, they enjoyed their vantage point, which had a panoramic view of the city. Elizabeth toured Florence and was excited to see the works of Raphael, Michelangelo, and other great artists. It should be stressed that at this point of her young adult life, Elizabeth was actually singularly determined to start off her career as an artist, with the desire to paint her first major artwork in the style of classical Italian religious motifs. She had no thoughts of becoming an artist focused on military war scenes. She took it upon herself to seek out a worthy art teacher in Florence and chose to be a student at the school of the Italian painter, Giuseppe Bellucci. He instructed her several times a week from May to October in 1869, at his studio in the Santa Reparata section of the city. Elizabeth noted how at this time and place, the scorching summer made the studio as hot as a furnace, mercilessly tormenting all inside alike, the teacher, the students, and their model. Nonetheless, she persevered in her lessons, and Bellucci's disciplinarian instruction greatly elevated her artistic, technical skills, which she found very much to her liking. Outside of her lessons, aside from enjoying the sketching trips together with her mother, who herself was a talented watercolor artist, Elizabeth spent her remaining time studying the great works of classical art all over the city. She sketched copies of what she described as exquisite figures in a local church fresco painted by the Renaissance artist she admired very much, Andrea del Sarto. Elizabeth's diary portrayed how she was always a serious-minded art student. This being reflective of how great artists typically begin their lifelong careers. She exemplified how it is the many years of single-minded purpose and dedication to practicing and studying their craft, which leads to these renowned artists' creations being adored by art lovers. The simplistic presumption that classical artists are mystically bestowed with an inherent great skill has no merit nor any connection to the actual reality. On their path to self-made greatness, the artists' personal styles are influenced by their mentors, teachers, and also the works and lifestyle experiences of other artists they idolize. Elizabeth's path as a future formidable artist was set on course during her time in Florence. Her teacher, Mr. Bellucci, made a dramatic impact on her eventual style she would use in her major paintings. She had described his talents being strong in drawing, and less so in the use of colors. Elizabeth left a strong recollection of her rewarding experience as his student and his impact on her significant development.
On October 21st, I bade goodbye to Bellucci. His system forbade praise for the pupil, which was rather depressing, but he relaxed sufficiently to tell my father at parting that I would do things and that I was untiring, taking study seriously, unlike the others. With this I had to be content. He had drilled me in drawing more severely than I could have been drilled in England. For that purpose, he had kept me a good deal to painting in monochrome, so as to have my attention absorbed by the drawing and modeling, and chiaroscuro of an object, without the distraction of color. He also said to me, I could now walk alone, and, with this valedictory goodbye, we parted. Being free, I spent the remaining time at Florence in visits to the churches and galleries with my father and sister, seeing works I had not had time to study up till then.
The last stages of the family voyage included further interesting stayovers along the way, going into the summer of 1870. In Rome, alongside enjoying its history and art culture, Elizabeth took an interest in many Zouave soldiers there, and attended a carnival which concluded with the Barbary, the traditional riderless horse race spectacle. To top everything off, she witnessed the Pope, saluted by his papal soldiers and being revered by a large crowd during the Easter ceremony. Later in the evening, she was then treated to the splendid sight of the famous illumination of St. Peter's Dome. It was also in Rome where Elizabeth finished her first painting that she had sold. She saw the wonderful artworks of Titian, Tintoretto, and Parma Vecchio in Venice. Elizabeth was somewhat torn between her two paths as a painter she could choose. One of those fates would potentially see her as a devoted follower and copier of the Italian classical religious style, which she predicted would not likely differentiate her from other similar artists. As such, Elizabeth would end up quite ordinary as an artist. In contrast, if she ventured in the direction of painting major military scenes, she would satisfy her natural inclination towards being extraordinary and self-empowering. She would be able to be unique in achieving her own style of art, and being a pioneering dominant painter in that war genre, which was not such a popular topic in Britain at that time, especially for her to do so as a Victorian-era woman. She admitted as much, recalling,
I wish I could have another life, to share the joys of those who paint what I studied in Italy, if only for the love of such work.
Back in England again that summer, Elizabeth resumed her studies at the South Kensington Art School. But then a sudden shocking world-changing event occurred in July of 1870. The Franco-Prussian War broke out. The French and German armies were clashing in major battles and sieges, which transfixed the attention of Europe. Elizabeth was also affected to the point where she turned away from her brief love affair with Italian art classics, and instead was motivated by the ongoing mood of war to devote herself towards painting mostly military scenes. Elizabeth industriously painted many military watercolors, all of which were sold quickly through her two chosen art dealers. In 1871, while at her second family home in Ventnor, on the Isle of Wight, she also kept busy with painting portraits of friends and relations, and even some religious topic scenes. It's interesting to note that the few religious paintings that Elizabeth had completed on the side at this time were submitted by her to the Royal Academy of Art in London for exhibition considerations. And each one was sent back to her, as rejections. But later, after she'd made a name for herself, these paintings quickly sold. In 1872, Elizabeth's father, her ever-supportive big fan, changed the course of her life when he brought her to view a large military field day exercise, taking place that fall in the area of Southampton. She was in her natural element that day, while enthusiastically making watercolor sketches of the many various soldiers' activities taking place. When Elizabeth was introduced to the attending army top brass commanders, they took a keen interest in the talented young female artist who was eagerly drawing the otherwise mundane military drills and training. They were impressed enough by the young lady's charm to then give her the privilege of setting up her art station more to her convenience just ahead of the scheduled big live-action mock battle. And, with one of these not-so-dramatic drawings, soldiers watering horses, she found a buyer. Mr. Charles Galloway from Manchester. Not long after, he then arranged the commission for another military painting from Elizabeth. In 1873, the Royal Academy of Art in London accepted and exhibited her first military painting. It was called Missing, depicting a solemn scene set in the recent Franco-Prussian War. At the end of 1873, Elizabeth set herself up in her new Fulham Street studio in London. She received a lot of support in the move from family and close acquaintances and one of her art teachers. Then she began Mr. Galloway's commission, which was to be a Crimean War-themed painting, commonly known as the Roll Call. The central scene featuring a group of battle-hardened British grenadiers, weary from recent combat as they stand at attention on snow-covered ground during a roll call. To properly research the correct military uniforms for her historic-themed artworks, Elizabeth's reliable helpers would obtain the genuine clothing in second-hand condition from London's backstreet army surplus stores and pawn shops. The painting was finished by the spring of 1874. She received her cheque for £126 for the painting. Today, in 2024, the equivalence would be around £14,000. Not bad for an artist starting one's career relatively unknown. More importantly, Elizabeth was wise enough to keep the copyright for it, and that decision earned her £1,200 more when that was bought just 2 months later, which is worth £170,000 equivalents in 2024. It should be mentioned that Elizabeth occasionally felt somewhat unsatisfied with her large paintings once they were finished. She was not confident the roll call would be favoured by the Academy or the public. However, the exhibition of the painting was monstrously successful. Elizabeth was instantly highly acclaimed during the private show premiere event at the Academy by its prominent members, along with excited art patrons adoring high society personalities and emotional army veterans. Best of all for Elizabeth was the appearance of her art school friends on the Academy's opening day for the ecstatic public. They were delighted to see their long-time predictions for Elizabeth's success actually come true. A young self-made female superstar which Elizabeth had become was unheard of in the 1870s. Put in context, such a feat is commonplace in our times, with the likes of comparative sensational celebrity artists such as Taylor Swift, Lady Gaga and Beyoncé, just to name a few. The roll call was being praised as the talk of the clubs and the hit of the season. Naturally, Elizabeth was mesmerized by her sudden popularity, but she remained well-grounded. She remembered the moment back in her childhood, when her father wisely advised her to be wary of the fickleness of sudden success. As for Mr. Galloway, he was assailed by desperate offers to buy his painting, coming from the Academy and even the Prince of Wales. He finally gave in to the royal family's desire to possess it, but in return he sold it for 10 times what he'd bought it for, and he was promised Elizabeth's next painting, which would be a Waterloo campaign theme. He agreed to buy it from her for £1,100 along with the copyright for it. The overwhelming fanfare and rave reviews for the roll call made Elizabeth Britain's foremost and much desired military artist of her time, and with that, her fame and fortune skyrocketed. She was one of those rare artists who had succeeded in making a prominent name for herself, and did so while still in her 20s. Elizabeth and her father went on a 2-week trip to France at the beginning of December. She indulged herself in an intensive schedule while in Paris, visiting many galleries, exhibits and the studios of prominent French military artists. This list included the great master artist, Jean-Léon Gérôme, who she met while he was painting a picture. Elizabeth described the encounter as an epoch in her life. She also went to the studio of Edward Détaille, which she observed to be beautiful, and praised the artist as being the greatest admiration for her at that time. She also saw one of Alphonse de Neuville's war paintings at an exhibit called Roof Combat. He was an artist whose work, she said, deeply impressed her. Elizabeth was back home in England again by mid-December, and she was full of energy to start her commissioned painting for Mr. Galloway. Its title: The 28th Regiment at Quatre Bras. The scene has young-faced British soldiers as the central focus in the picture, posed dramatically resolute in their regiment's square formation, while bravely defying the last charge of French cavalrymen as they swarmed around them during the Battle of Quatre Bras. That brutal fight was a prelude to the bigger Battle of Waterloo, to be fought 2 days later. She began the painting in the first months of 1875. With her fame established, Lady Butler was granted various privileges by the British Army when making preparatory sketches for her paintings, being a guest of honor at Army campgrounds. In one memorable session, British commanders at one camp had 300 of their combat engineers set up in a 4-rank deep square formation, similar to what Lady Butler would depict in her Quatre Bras painting. She took another trip to the Horse Guards Regiment's riding school stables to sketch mounted riders in dynamic action poses as studies for the French cavalrymen in the painting. She recounted how she had one of her most extraordinary sketching adventures, which, unknown to her, would also serve as inspiration for her distant future painting, Scotland Forever. The brave artist boldly put her safety in jeopardy, in a harrowing daring stunt, all for the sake of art.
At the Horse Guards riding school, I was favored with a charge. With the Quatre Bras painting in my head, I tried to fancy myself as one of my young fellows in it, facing off against a cavalry attack. I arranged for 2 mounted troopers to ride full tilt at me. On the first charge, I quickly got out of the way, and I fear that my expression was much too feminine and passive. But, against the second charge, I stood my ground. The troopers pulled up within 2 yards of where I stood, covering me with sawdust.
In June of 1877, Elizabeth Thompson married an Irish-born British Army officer, Major William Butler, and thereafter she became more famously known as Lady Butler. In 1880, Lady Butler then finished her painting, Rorke's Drift, depicting the victory of a tiny heroic British garrison during the Zulu War in 1879. It was a commission requested by Queen Victoria herself. A year later, in 1881, Lady Butler finished and exhibited her legendary epic military artwork, Scotland Forever. She actually started the project in 1879 in a rather odd way, which happened when she was invited to the Grosvenor Gallery on London's Bond Street to see a show featuring a new wave of artistic style in Britain, called the Aesthetic Movement. The philosophy behind this emerging trend was to present arts and designs in a modern, stylish, beautified way, which contradicted the traditional classical norms of Victorian-era art forms. The Grosvenor Gallery had opened in 1877 and was considered to be the headquarters of the aesthetic artists, which included painters, designers, writers, musicians, and other creative types who all agreed on promoting the principle of art for art's sake. Lady Butler was among those traditionalists who remained dedicated to appreciating foremost all things classical, and they did not hide their bitter distaste towards the aesthetic movement, much in the same way society's conservative establishment in the 1960s and 70s frowned upon the flamboyant hippie generation. So, when Lady Butler was invited to an aesthetics exhibit at the Grosvenor Gallery, she described the experience and, more importantly, how that led to the painting of Scotland Forever.
I spent much of a cool and rainy summer at Edenbridge in Kent, taking a cottage there. My parents were with me. I was busy making studies of any grey horses I could find, as I had already begun my charge of the Scots Greys at Waterloo at my studio. That charge I called Scotland Forever, and I owe the subject to an impulse I received that season from the private view at the Grosvenor Gallery, now extinct. The Grosvenor was the home of the aesthetes of the period, whose sometimes unwholesome productions preceded those of our modern impressionists. I felt myself getting more and more annoyed while perambulating those rooms, and to such a point of exasperation was I impelled, that I fairly fled outside, and breathed the honest air of Bond Street, and then I took a hansom cab to my studio. When I got back there, I pinned a 7-foot sheet of brown paper onto an old canvas, and with a piece of charcoal and a piece of white chalk, I then flung the charge of the Greys upon it. Dr. Pollard, my dearest family friend, who still looked out for me during my husband's absences, as he used to do in my maiden days, came to see if all was well with me, and found me in a surprising mood.
Lady Butler seemed determined to unleash a striking reprisal against the unconventional aesthetes by painting a powerful battle scene that symbolized the glorification of British military prestige and traditional heritage. To recreate that vision, she would muster the memories from all of her vivid observations and close-up encounters of live British cavalry charges performed at army camps, such as at Aldershot. She recalled,
"I twice saw a charge of the Greys before painting Scotland Forever, and I stood in front to see them coming on. One cannot of course stop too long to see them clothes. Those Scots Greys, I only half saw through the dust storm at Aldershot, pulling up in the midst of a tremendous charge very close to us.
As was her custom, Lady Butler included many authentic details in the painting, such as the Scots Greys uniforms. Using artistic license, Lady Butler chose to show the Scots Greys soldiers and horses, appearing immaculately attired as if they were dressed up for one of their ceremonial military parades back in London. In reality, one of the Scots Greys who was at Waterloo described the wretched appearance of all the soldiers in Wellington's army on the morning before the battle started. This was due to hours of incessant torrential rainfall which had saturated the region overnight, after a memorable thunderstorm had erupted during the afternoon on the day before. The rain was so heavy, the red dye of the Scots Greys' uniform jackets bled into the white equipment belts, turning them pink. Add to this the copious amounts of mud which stained the unfortunate soldiers' uniforms and accoutrements, along with their horses. When recreating the specific battle scenes she portrayed in her art, Lady Butler would try to conduct interviews with campaign veterans who were actually present. Sometimes this itself frustrated her, because as is often the case, not all witnesses involved in the same scene will have the same story to tell, and so, Lady Butler found herself having to make her own final assessment on what happened. By this time in Lady Butler's life, there were not many surviving British Waterloo veterans to have such discussions with, to gather authentic details from them. As such, it's understandable to see various small errors in the picture, which was not the case in her war paintings that were more current and recent, allowing her to research more accurately. One notices in Scotland Forever the technically correct upright position of most of the swords being held up high by the British cavalrymen. The Scots Greys were trained in the British heavy cavalry tradition of using powerful chopping attacks with their big swords, smashing deep into their enemies' heads, necks, shoulders, and arms, with overhead swings and slashing blows, and devastating backhand strikes. In contrast, French heavy cavalry troopers pointed their swords at their enemies when they charged. This was a prelude to their own custom of using their swords in deadly deep thrusting attacks, aimed at piercing their opponents' faces and torsos. Lady Butler noticeably fixes the line of the Scots Greys' raised swords, again in a radiating fan shape, to give more added emphasis to the domineering and overall arrow-shaped motion effect of the painting. Seen in the foreground of the ploughed field, below the charging horses' hooves, are the lines of the furrows, cleverly patterned with the same narrowing illusion. Lady Butler's portrayal of the Scots Greys' attack being a wild charge from the start is fantasy only. The Scots Greys started their assault moving forward in a short trot, to give support to the Highland infantry regiments who were uphill ahead of them, fighting desperately in close combat against the more numerous French infantry. One can vaguely see some Highland infantry placed in the background on the right side of the picture. To avoid riding down the Highland infantry from behind, the Scots Greys had to slow their advance to a walk, then, they carefully waded into the helpless masses of enemy infantrymen, ferociously chopping their swords down upon the heads of those who resisted, and also at times, upon those who did not. Even unarmed boys who were drummers and fifers were slaughtered. A smaller error appears in the sky above the Scots Greys, where artillery shell bursts are shown exploding. Only the British Army had developed what was called shrapnel explosives that were fired by their cannons during Napoleonic land battles. Shrapnel shells exploded high in the air above their enemies' heads, to rain down a deadly spray of bullets when a set fuse in the artillery shell made it burst apart near the end of its flight. French field artillery did not fire this specific type of ammunition during the Napoleonic Wars. The Scots Greys suffered heavy losses during their epic 20-minute counterattack, including the deaths of their brigade commander, Sir William Ponsonby, and their American-born regimental colonel, Inglis Hamilton. He is apparently the central figure in the painting, the officer seen leading the ill-fated charge. Hamilton was brave, but lacking any combat experience, he became reckless, and disastrously led his men further than was necessary. Nonetheless, the Greys, along with their fellow British heavy cavalry regiments involved in the fierce action, played a decisive role in destroying Napoleon's massive French attack that was on the verge of victory at Waterloo. The completion of the spectacular painting in 1881 had failed to present Lady Butler with the triumphant exhibit she had initially envisioned. Her autobiography hardly describes anything in the wake of Scotland Forever when it was first exhibited in public. There's no mention of any reaction from others about it. In her words,
"When I eventually finished that work, it ended up being exhibited alone. It's quite unnecessary to burden my readers with the reason of this. I was very sorry, as I expected rather a bright effect with all those white and grey galloping hippogriffs bounding out of the Academy walls. There was a lawsuit in question. And there, let the matter rest."
One interesting footnote related to Scotland Forever that Lady Butler recalled involved meeting one particular owner of a print of the painting while attending a large formal dinner party held at Farnborough Hill in Warwickshire, England, in 1894. Two of the esteemed guests were the brothers, Victor and Louis Bonaparte, the grandsons of Napoleon Bonaparte's brother, Jerome. The younger brother, Louis, would later become the future head of the Bonaparte family, and was at that time serving as a cavalry officer in the Russian army. While dining with Lady Butler nearby him, he told his fellow guests how he had acquired the Scotland Forever print when he spotted it in a Moscow market shop, and later hung it up proudly in his regimental quarters. He also expressed his delight in the surprising opportunity to personally meet the celebrated artist behind his treasured artwork. Lady Butler probably never imagined that less than 100 years later, Scotland Forever would outshine her other major military artworks. Scotland Forever has become a popular featured image for numerous Waterloo campaign publications of books, online articles, wargame dioramas, and even faithfully duplicated in live action for one of the most exciting military docudrama movie scenes ever directed. It was a spectacular head-on sequence of the Scots Greys charge in the epic 1970 movie, Waterloo. Scotland Forever has now become a legendary iconic artwork among the community of Napoleonic Era enthusiasts. And so, less than 10 years after the blazing start to her career with the roll call painting, Lady Butler's extraordinary rise as an independent pioneering female military artist began to diminish. She painted several notable military artworks in that time and lesser-known ones after Scotland Forever. She had twice bravely endured occasions where she faced systemic sexual discrimination. The first time was before she was famous, where she had entered a religious painting into an art exhibition hosted by the Vatican in Rome. Though the jury was impressed with the submission and accepted it for the exhibit, young Elizabeth was barred by gender rules from viewing it on-site in a men's-only area. Then came the repeated turndowns Lady Butler endured, when, although nominated 3 times, and even with her fame established, she was not rightfully elected to membership in the British Royal Academy of Art, due to the outdated old boys' club ideals stubbornly held by the mostly sexist male voters. Lady Butler continued her love of painting, as her otherwise busy family schedule allowed. Her works would expand to include many beautifully peaceful landscapes and normal everyday living scenes, in particular the collections she made while following her husband on his overseas military assignments, such as her memorable picture journal of her time spent in Egypt. While expressing the greatest empathy for British soldiers at war, Lady Butler did not complain about the privileges and social standing she and the British elites enjoyed, that came from the wealth plundered by the United Kingdom's military expansionism across the globe. In writing about her painting, Rorke's Drift, Lady Butler referred to her Zulu warriors, with a mix of praise and arrogant privileged contempt, by describing them as heroic savages. Thomas James Thompson, the father of Swiss-born Lady Butler, was a white Briton, born in Jamaica, at a time when the island's population had many diverse ethnicities. His grandfather had 3 slave plantations on the island. He was a staunch liberal and at the same time, encouraged Elizabeth to be a devout English patriot. And yet, she always loved living in Italy foremost, even while she was very traditionally British throughout her life. However, she was vocal in criticising the heavy-handed British rule over Ireland. In reaction to one scene she witnessed while there on her honeymoon, Lady Butler painted an unflattering scene of a destitute Irish woman being evicted from her home by British authorities. She had 6 children and lived with her youngest daughter in the final years of her life. Both of her sons served in the British Army during the First World War, during which one of them luckily recovered from a severe injury received in combat. Lady Butler died in 1933 at the age of 86.